The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 7th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. Yet he could not escape notice, but a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home and found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, be opened. And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one, but the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord. So you may remember from studying ancient world history that in the early 300s BC, Alexander the Great conquered most of the Mediterranean basin, extending through what is today all of the Middle East, parts of Turkey, Egypt, and even into Iran. It was a massive empire that spread Greek culture and Greek language throughout all of those areas for the next several hundred years. One of the results of Alexander's conquest was that Greek effectively became the international language throughout all of those places. Even when the Romans conquered those areas and even more, Greek had become so ingrained as the international language that Latin was actually very rarely used except for official business. This is why, for instance, that when Pontius Pilate writes the charge against Jesus on the cross and says, "This is Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," he writes it in 3 languages. He writes it in Latin because it's the official language and he has to. He writes it in Hebrew because it's the local language that people could read. But people from all over the world were running around and the Romans wanted everybody to know, you do this, this is what happens to you. So he wrote it in Greek, because almost everybody who was there who didn't speak the local language could be counted on to understand Greek. And so in those days, if you wanted to write something that you knew everyone could understand and you wanted to reach a very wide audience, you wrote in Greek. And this is why every single one of 27 documents of our New Testament are all originally written in Greek. This is true even when Paul writes to the early Christian community in Rome. He writes to them in Greek, not in Latin. And while everybody couldn't read and write Greek, if you wrote in Greek, the chances were very high that there would be many people in the community you wrote to who could read and translate the Greek into whatever the local language might be. And so it was a waste of papyrus and ink, both of which were very expensive, to spend time transliterating foreign words that most people wouldn't understand anyway. Just write it out in Greek. Mark's Gospel, also written in Greek, is the shortest of our 4 Gospels, and Mark is often short on details. He's in a hurry to tell a story, and he doesn't want to waste time or paper. And yet, in today's reading, Mark does something he only actually does 4 times in the entire book. He transliterates an Aramaic word used by Jesus and takes time and space to translate it into Greek. It happens as Jesus is presented with a person who can't hear. And Mark says Jesus sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha." It's an Aramaic word, which is a dialect of Hebrew, which Jesus would have spoken. And it's a very basic, common word, which simply means, like, open up. It's not unusual or otherwise associated with mystical powers to do anything. But Mark records that particular Aramaic word, and he takes time and space to translate it, even though there is really no reason to do so. He could just as easily have written, Jesus sighed and said, "Be opened." And indeed, that's what Mark does most other places. But here, he takes time to remember the word Ephphatha. Why? I mean, there is actually no short answer to that question, but I suspect that this story came from people in Mark's community who somehow remembered this particular healing event whenever they heard that common word Ephphatha. And they remembered Jesus and what he had done. And so that word became an essential part of the story. It became a reminder of what God had done for them. But it was just a simple word, and it wasn't an uncommon word. Jesus himself probably didn't use it thinking anybody would remember it, because indeed, right after this, he keeps telling people, be quiet and don't tell others about this, but they keep doing it. But that word, Ephphatha, continued to have meaning for people in ways that made Mark continue to include it in the story, because it just wasn't the story without that word. And this is a story, by the way, that is unique to Mark. I've sometimes told people that, Mark's gospel, 98% of it is repeated someplace in Matthew and Luke. Not this one. This is an actual part of something that is absolutely unique to Mark and unique to his community that remembered this story. And so as I was thinking about this, it occurred to me that sometimes when God does something with us or through us, people remember what God did because of a word or a thing or a simple action that does not seem all that significant to us at the moment. It seems very common. For example, it has happened in my life, and probably in yours also, that somebody has told me something I said to them that really helped them through a difficult moment. And they tell me what it was I said, and I don't remember ever saying that. In fact, I may not even remember the conversation at all. And it's almost always the case that when people come up to me and say, you told this to me, and you gave me this piece of advice, or you said this to me at this moment, it's never anything that's profound or deeply insightful. It's very common. But it was a simple thing like Ephphatha that helped that person through a hard time. And it's okay that it's not a profound thing, and even that I do not remember saying it. God used something I said, and the person who needed it remembered that they found help and healing through it. And it's what God does with our words, especially the simple words, that are what's important. And so remember that, even if you don't find out about it. Sometimes a simple word you speak to someone, some basic thing that you do, that you say, that sounds like just basic advice or help, or just a word of comfort to them, can be the Ephphatha that God uses to help and heal somebody who, like this person suddenly thrust in front of Jesus, you may not even know. And sometimes Ephphatha can be a simple thing that forever brings to mind an event of God's help and healing in your life or in somebody else's life. A thing can have a big impact because that thing continues to be the thing you remember, and it remembers that event. So I have told this funny story before about when I was a real little kid and my grandparents lived on Long Beach Island, and we would go there to visit. My grandmother always had this bowl of Hershey bars, full-size Hershey bars. You remember this when you're 4 or 5 years old, right? And every time I went there, Grandma would give me one of these full-size Hershey bars. I remember this. So one of the things that you learn is if your grandparents live to when you're an adult, and you can check out these stories with them. So sometime in my early 30s, I was telling this story to Grandma, and I said, I remember you always gave me one of those full-size Hershey bars because you always had that bowl of Hershey bars sitting in the kitchen. And she looks at me funny. It's like, full-size? When did I have? Yeah, you always had this bowl of full-size Hershey bars. And she thought about it for a minute, and she says, well, during Halloween, I would give out full-size Hershey bars as Halloween, trick-or-treat stuff. So if you guys had come down right after Halloween, I've been trying to get rid of them. So I would have given you one, and I put them in Pop-Pop's lunch and all that kind of stuff. And she said, yeah, only have been that one time. She's clearly had a big effect on you. And it did, because that can have a big effect at one time. just once, that one thing. But I wonder if the same thing may happen for folks who get a simple bar of soap or a towel from the care kits that we're putting together, or one of these quilts that are hanging around in our sanctuary. They are basic stuff that we have in all of our houses. We don't really think about that stuff a whole lot. And the quilts that are hanging here are very nice, but they are not the ones that win the prizes at the Montgomery County Fair. They're very basic quilts. But probably for some folks, forever after, a bar of soap, maybe the brand of soap that they happen to get, or a simple quilt that they see, maybe the Ephphatha that reminds them of what God did for them through others in a time of great need in their life. That thing can be that thing, that Ephphatha for them. And sometimes, Ephphatha can simply be your presence in somebody's life. You showed up at a time when somebody needed it. You didn't do anything special, and there was nothing at all you could say, but you were there. Sometimes that's the thing. That's the Ephphatha moment. One of the last things that I did on internship was to visit one of the congregation's shut-in members. Pastor and I would go visit the shut-ins that we had. And there was this lady that we had visited, and she was in a nursing home the entire time that I was there. And when we would go and we would visit her, she never spoke. I'm not sure what it was, whether she had dementia or what kinds of things were going on, but we weren't even sure that she knew we were in the room. But we would go and we would visit her and do the best we could, and it was clear right before I left internship that she was on her way out. So we visited her several times in this 1 week, and actually the last shut-in visit I went to see her, and I had been there a few days before, and her eyes were closed. She was unconscious. She had been unconscious the day before also. And I did the usual thing where I was, hi, this is Vicar Steve, I'm here, I just came to see, pray with you and see how you're doing. And at that moment, she opened her eyes, she looked at me, and for the very first and only time she spoke, and she says, yeah, I didn't remember much, but I remember you were here. And that was the last thing I learned on internship, was that sometimes, even if you don't think it's noticed, sometimes it's just that you were there makes a difference. And many of you have been people who have been there for others in difficult times, where there was nothing really you could do, and there was nothing really to say. But sometimes just your presence in somebody's life was the Ephphatha that reminded them that they were not alone, and your presence was God's presence for them in that moment. Sometimes a simple word doesn't seem all that important, and sometimes, as in today's gospel reading, it can be easy to pass over one of these Aramaic transliterated words as just another difficult to pronounce word that you're glad that the pastor has to deal with. But sometimes it's a simple word that God gives you to speak that makes a difference in somebody's life. Sometimes it's a simple thing that you share that makes God's presence known in a way that you cannot imagine at the moment. And often, it's simply by being present that you open yourself to becoming God's Ephphatha in the life of a person who needs God's presence.